He confessed to being there when she was killed. He is in prison for manslaughter. But nearly 30 years later, he still refuses to tell her parents where he buried her body. This is the unsettled verdict in the disappearance of Kiplyn Davis. May 2, 1995. In the small town of Spanish Fork, Utah, 15-year-old Kiplyn Davis walks into her high school for morning classes. After lunch, she is never seen again. For years, her disappearance was a mystery, clouded by rumors of a teenage runaway. The case went cold, leaving her family in an agony of not knowing. There was no crime scene, no witnesses, and no body. The case was finally broken, not by finding new evidence, but by a clever legal strategy, a perjury trap, set for her former classmates. This strategy would lead to a conviction, but it would not lead to the truth. It delivered a guilty verdict, but it failed to deliver peace, or bring Kiplyn home. Here is the first part of your story, focusing on the day of the disappearance and the initial investigation. The vanishing. May 2, 1995. In the small, close-knit community of Spanish Fork, Utah, the day began with the familiar rhythms of American life. It was a Tuesday. Morning bells rang, and the hallways of Spanish Fork High School filled with the noise and energy of teenagers. Among them was 15-year-old Kiplyn Davis. A sophomore, Kiplyn was known as a good student, a bright and vibrant personality who moved easily through the social circles of her school. She was a member of the drill team, a daughter, a friend. She attended her morning classes, sharing notes and laughs with friends, her day indistinguishable from any other. But this day would become a dividing line, marking the end of before, and the beginning of a dark, agonizing after. Kiplyn was last seen at school during the lunch break. When the bell rang to summon students back to class, she did not return. She was there, and then, in the space of a single lunch hour, she was gone. In any disappearance, the first hours are a fog of confusion. As the school day ended and Kiplyn failed to return home, the quiet concern of her parents, Richard and Tamara Davis, began to sharpen into a distinct and terrible fear. But as they, and soon the Spanish Fork Police Department, began to piece together the girl's final days, a complicated and ultimately misleading narrative emerged. Kiplyn, for all her vibrancy, was also a typical teenager. She navigated the complex pressures of adolescence and, like many 15-year-olds, had moments of friction with her parents. On the very morning she vanished, she had been in an argument at home. This fact, layered on top of another discovery, would send the initial investigation in a direction that cost them precious, irretrievable time. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Kiplyn had made casual, off-the-cuff comments to some of her friends about the idea of running away. For investigators, these two facts, a fight at home and talk of running away, became the most plausible explanation. It was a narrative that made sense. A frustrated teenager, acting on impulse, had simply walked away. This theory, seemingly logical, would cloud the case for months. It provided an answer, but it was the wrong one. This initial assumption, that Kiplyn was a runaway, not a victim, meant the area was not immediately treated as a potential crime scene. The search was not as frantic or focused as it might have been. The investigation was geared toward finding a missing person, not catching a predator. But the runaway theory had a fatal flaw. Kiplyn. She had taken nothing with her. No change of clothes, no money, no backpack. Her driver's education card was left behind in her locker. She had no history of such behavior. And as the hours turned into days, the most damning evidence against the runaway theory was the profound and terrifying silence. A teenager who runs away eventually reaches out. They call a friend. They use money. They appear somewhere. Kiplyn Davis had simply evaporated. The local police, soon joined by the FBI, found themselves at a dead end before they had even truly begun. There was no crime scene to process, no witnesses to an abduction, and no physical evidence of any kind. There was only an empty space where a 15-year-old girl should have been. The theory of a runaway teenager, once a source of comfort and logic, began to crumble. It left behind a vacuum, a terrifying void that would soon be filled by a town's worst fears, and a family's unending nightmare. The search for Kiplyn Davis had begun, but the trail was already cold. Here is the continuation of the story, focusing on the cold trail and the burden of uncertainty. The cold trail. The initial theory of a teenage runaway, which had provided a false structure for the investigation, soon collapsed under its own weight. As days turned into weeks, the grim reality set in. Kiplyn had not left. She had been taken. This realization, however, brought investigators no closer to an answer. It only deepened the mystery. The joint task force of the Spanish Fork Police Department and the FBI found themselves confronting a void. In the stark light of day, from the center of a populated high school, a girl had vanished without a single trace. The investigation was hamstrung by a fundamental problem. There was nothing to investigate. There was no crime scene. The school campus, scoured after the fact, offered no clues. There were no witnesses who saw an abduction. Her friends saw her one moment, and she was gone the next. And critically, there was no physical evidence, no fibers, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The case had no starting point, no thread for detectives to pull. In the absence of hard facts, the community of Spanish Fork filled the void with speculation. A town built on trust and familiarity was suddenly forced to look inward, to wonder if a monster walked among them. Answer, the whispers began. Rumors, born of fear and imagination, took root and spread like weeds. They offered simple, gruesome answers to an unbearable question. Some said her body was buried deep in the rugged, sprawling expanse of Spanish Fork Canyon, a place vast enough to hide any secret. Others whispered she had been hidden in an old, abandoned train tunnel. One persistent rumor claimed she was entombed in the concrete foundation of a new building project in town. For the investigators, these rumors were not just gossip, they were obligations. Each one, no matter how wild, had to be pursued. Teams were dispatched to search the canyon. Tunnels were explored. Construction sites were questioned. But every lead, every whisper, every desperate tip from a psychic or a local with a hunch, evaporated on contact. Each trail led to a dead end. For the Davis family, this cycle was a particular kindling torment. Every new search was a spike of horrific hope, the hope of at least finding her, of being able to bring her home, followed by the crushing weight of another failure. Months blurred into years. The investigation, once a flurry of urgent activity, slowed to a crawl. Detectives were reassigned. The case files, thick with dead-end reports and unsubstantiated rumors, grew cold. Kiplyn's name, once on the front page, faded from the news, but never from the heart of the community. She became a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a permanent, unanswered question hanging over the town. The trail had not just gone cold, it had vanished, just as Kiplyn herself had done. Here is the continuation of the story, focusing on the Davis family's agonizing uncertainty. A family in limbo. For Richard and Tamara Davis, the cold case was not a file in a cabinet, it was a daily, unending agony. They were trapped in the most cruel of human conditions, an ambiguous loss. They existed in an agonizing limbo, unable to mourn a daughter they could not be certain was dead, yet unable to hope for the return of a girl who had been gone for so long. Every day was a fresh wave of grief and questions. Every phone call, every knock at the door, held the potential for either miraculous news or the devastating confirmation of their worst fears. This state of not knowing is a unique kind of torment. There is no funeral to mark an ending, no grave to visit, no path forward. There is only a bottomless void of, what if? This uncertainty poisoned the passage of time. Birthdays and holidays became painful reminders of her absence. Kiplyn's room was left untouched, a snapshot of a life interrupted, suspended in the spring of 1995. For her parents and siblings, the world moved on, but they remained anchored to that single Tuesday afternoon. As the years passed, the silence from investigators and the absence of the daughter became a crushing weight. By 1999, 4 years had passed since Kiplyn was last seen. The Davis family had to confront an impossible choice. How do you grieve for someone who is simply gone? They made a decision that was both heartbreaking and necessary. They chose to hold a memorial service for Kiplyn. It was a way to publicly acknowledge their loss, to create a space for their own grief and for the grief of a community that had also lost her. In the Spanish Fork City Cemetery, they erected a memorial marker in her name. This granite stone was a physical testament to a life lived, even without a body to lay to rest. It was a public acknowledgement of a loss they could not privately resolve. It was not a surrender. It was not giving up hope of finding her. It was an act of desperate love, an attempt to claim some small measure of peace in a situation that offered none. It gave them a place to go, a place to sit and remember and weep. But it was a hollow comfort. It was a headstone without a grave, a memorial for a mystery, and it brought no answers. Here is the continuation of the story, focusing on the new legal strategy. A new strategy. For 8 long years, the case languished. The memorial marker in the Spanish Fork Cemetery stood as a silent testament to a crime unsolved and a family shattered. The investigation, for all practical purposes, was dormant, buried in a cold case file. Then, in 2003, the legal landscape shifted dramatically. The breakthrough came not from a hiker stumbling upon remains or a guilty conscience driving a confession. It came from a shrewd and patient legal strategy conceived by federal prosecutors. Frustrated by the complete lack of progress on the state level, the U.S. Attorney's Office convened a federal grand jury to investigate Kiplyn's disappearance. This was the turning point. The state's investigators had been stymied by a fundamental problem. They lacked the direct evidence required to charge anyone with murder. Without a body, a weapon, or a crime scene, proving a homicide, beyond a reasonable doubt, was a nearly impossible standard to meet. The federal prosecutors, however, decided to attack the case from an entirely different angle. If they couldn't prove the murder itself, they would go after the cover-up. They would target the lies. This new strategy became known as the perjury trap. The grand jury has immense power, including the authority to subpoena witnesses and compel them to testify under oath. Lying to a federal grand jury is a serious crime, perjury. Investigators had long believed that a small circle of Kiplyn's former classmates knew far more than they were telling, that they were bound by a dark, shared secret. Now, those individuals would be forced to speak, and if they lied, they would face federal prison. The central figure in this new strategy was a name that had surfaced in rumors for years: Timmy Brent Olsen. Olsen was a former classmate of Kiplyn's. He, along with several others, was called to testify before the grand jury about what he knew, where he was on May 2, 1995, and what he had heard. He told his story under oath. And the prosecutors, armed with years of accumulated, albeit circumstantial, evidence, believed he was lying. In 2005, a decade after Kiplyn vanished, Timmy Brent Olsen was indicted. But the charge wasn't murder. He was charged with 16 counts of perjury. This legal maneuver was a masterstroke. The upcoming perjury trial would, in effect, become a proxy for the murder case itself. To prove that Olsen had lied to the grand jury, prosecutors would first have to establish what the truth was. This gave them a legal backdoor to present a mountain of incriminating evidence about Olsen's likely involvement in Kiplyn's disappearance. Evidence that would never have seen the light of day in a state murder trial. They didn't have to prove he killed her, they only had to prove he lied about it. The strategy was to dismantle his credibility, to break him under the weight of his own deceptions. This was not just a step in the investigation. It became the weapon that would finally break the case open. The wall of silence, which had held firm for a decade, was about to be brought down, brick by brick. Here is the continuation of the story, focusing on the pivotal perjury trial. The perjury trial. The federal perjury trial of Timmy Brent Olsen began, and it was unlike any trial the community had ever seen. The charge on the docket was perjury, but the true, unspoken subject was murder. This was the case against Kiplyn's killer, presented to a jury under the guise of a trial about lying. The prosecution's task was meticulous. They had to take each of Olsen's 16 alleged lies to the grand jury and, one by one, prove to the jury that they were, in fact, lies. This process systematically dismantled Olsen's credibility and, in doing so, constructed a damning portrait of his involvement. Prosecutors brought witnesses who contradicted Olsen's sworn testimony about his whereabouts on May 2, 1995. They proved he had lied about when he last claimed to have seen Kiplyn. Perhaps most damningly, they brought forward individuals who testified that Olsen had actively tried to procure a false alibi from them, asking them to lie on his behalf, a desperate act that spoke volumes about what he was trying to hide. But the trial went far beyond just calendars and timelines. The legal doorway created by the perjury charge allowed prosecutors to introduce evidence of Olsen's character and his past actions, painting a picture of a man capable of extreme violence. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as two separate women took the stand and testified that Timmy Brent Olsen had violently raped them in the years after Kiplyn's disappearance. This testimony was shocking, and it served a powerful strategic purpose. It established Olsen's capacity for violence against women, shattering any lingering image of him as just a high school kid caught in a lie. Then came the most chilling testimony of all. One after another, former friends and acquaintances of Olsen testified about the boasts and confessions they had heard him make over the years, often when he was drunk or trying to act tough. The details were varied, but the theme was consistent. Witnesses recalled Olsen claiming he was with Kiplyn in Spanish Fork Canyon on the day she vanished. They testified that he had bragged about getting into an argument with her and then taking care of her. One witness recounted Olsen's disturbing claim that he and another person had hit Kiplyn with a rock and hidden her body. For nearly a decade, these stories had been whispers, rumors dismissed as dark, drunken boasts. Now, they were being delivered under oath in a federal courtroom. By the time the prosecution rested, they had achieved the goal. While they had not legally proven Olsen murdered Kiplyn, they had comprehensively proven that he was a liar. And in doing so, they had shown the jury, and the world, exactly what he was lying about. The jury found him guilty. Timmy Brent Olsen was convicted on 15 counts of perjury and sentenced to 12.5 years in federal prison. It was a staggering sentence for lying, but it reflected the gravity of the truth he was concealing. He had been backed into a corner. He was now a convicted federal felon, his credibility was destroyed, and he was facing over a decade behind bars. The perjury trap had snapped shut. And with Olsen now incarcerated, state prosecutors finally had the leverage they needed to pursue the one charge that mattered: murder. Here is the continuation of the story, focusing on the plea deal. The plea deal. Timmy Brent Olsen was now a convicted felon, sitting in a federal prison cell, but his legal troubles were far from over. The perjury conviction was a resounding victory for the U.S. Attorney's Office, but it was only phase 1 of the strategy. Phase 2 began almost immediately. With Olsen's credibility publicly and legally destroyed, and with a mountain of incriminating testimony from the perjury trial now on the public record, state prosecutors in Utah finally had the leverage they had lacked for over a decade. They formally charged Timmy Brent Olsen with the first-degree murder of Kiplyn Davis. Olsen was in an impossible position. He was already serving a 12.5-year federal sentence. He was now facing a separate state trial for murder, a charge that carried a potential sentence of life in prison. The evidence and testimony that had just convicted him of lying would be paraded out again, this time to prove he was a killer. The pressure was immense. For several years, his case moved through the state court system. Then, in February 2011, nearly 16 years after Kiplyn Davis had vanished from her high school, a resolution was reached. To avoid a trial and a potential life sentence, Timmy Brent Olsen agreed to a plea deal. He would not plead guilty to murder. Instead, he would plead guilty to the lesser, second-degree felony charge of manslaughter. In exchange for this plea, the state recommended a sentence of 1 to 15 years, which would run concurrently, at the same time, as his 12.5-year federal sentence. This was a critical moment. For the first time, after 16 years of denials, lies, and silence, Timmy Brent Olsen was about to stand in a court of law and formally admit that he was criminally responsible for the death of Kiplyn Davis. The plea deal required him to make a statement to the court, to finally, after all this time, tell the story of what happened on the Tuesday in 1995. The Davis family, and the entire community, held their breath, waiting for the truth that had been buried for so long. Here is the continuation of the story, focusing on Olsen's courtroom confession. The confession. In February 2011, Timmy Brent Olsen stood before a judge, a packed courtroom, and the parents of Kiplyn Davis, who had waited 16 agonizing years for this very moment. Richard and Tamara Davis braced themselves, prepared to finally hear the truth, no matter how brutal. But the story Olsen offered was not the clear, complete confession they had prayed for. It was a cryptic, self-serving, and carefully constructed narrative that minimized his own culpability and shifted the ultimate act of violence onto a ghost. Olsen spoke in a low voice. He admitted that he was there. He claimed that on the Tuesday, he, Kiplyn, and another individual had driven up into Spanish Fork Canyon. He alleged that at some point, he and Kiplyn were separated from this other person. He then heard an argument. When he went to investigate, Olsen claimed, he witnessed this other individual, this unnamed accomplice, strike Kiplyn twice in the head with a rock, killing her. Olsen's admission of guilt was limited to the moments after her death. He admitted only to helping this other person move Kiplyn's body and hide it. This was his official story. He was a witness. He was an accessory after the fact. He was guilty of manslaughter, he admitted, but he was not the one who had taken her life. He painted himself as a follower, a scared participant who helped cover up a crime, not the man who committed it. For the Davis family, this confession was a devastating blow. It was a calculated statement, likely crafted by his legal team, designed to satisfy the terms of his plea deal while protecting him from further consequence. It provided a legal conclusion, a guilty plea, but it offered no emotional closure, no real truth. It raised more questions than it answered. Who was this other person? And, most importantly, if he helped move her body, where was she? Here is the continuation of the story, focusing on the devastating impact of the plea deal. An unsettled verdict. Timmy Brent Olsen's guilty plea brought the legal case to a close, but it felt like a hollow victory. For Richard and Tamara Davis, who had sat in that courtroom with a desperate, 16-year-long need for answers, the confession was a profound and agonizing disappointment. It was heartbreaking because it was not the truth, or at least, not the whole truth. It was a partial, self-serving story that protected Olsen by painting him as a mere accessory. It failed to provide the one thing the family craved more than a conviction: closure. The resolution left them with a conviction but no grave to visit. It gave them a guilty party but no sense of peace. This was the cruel genius of the plea agreement, and it highlighted two gaping holes in the justice that was served. Olsen was not required to name his alleged accomplice. His story placed the act of murder on an unnamed, other individual. The plea deal did not compel him to identify this person. This meant that, according to Olsen's own story, a killer was still free, their identity protected by the very man who had helped them. For the Davis family, this was an infuriating and incomplete form of justice. Most cruelly, Olsen was not required to reveal the location of Kiplyn's remains. This was the most devastating part of the agreement. After 16 years of searching, of wondering, of staring at an empty memorial stone, the one person who admitted to being there when she was hidden was under no legal obligation to tell her parents where she was. He had admitted to helping move her body. He knew where she was. But that information was not a condition of his plea. Kiplyn's parents had to watch the man who held the answer to the deepest, most painful question get a reduced sentence without ever having to give it up. They had the word, guilty, but they could not have the daughter back. They could not lay her to rest. The verdict was in, but for the Davis family, the case remained agonizingly, and permanently, unsettled. Here is the conclusion of the story, focusing on the case's current status. The case today. Today, Timmy Brent Olsen remains incarcerated, serving his concurrent state and federal sentences. The legal mechanisms of justice have run their course, but the human toll, the profound agony for the Davis family, continues. In 2021, Olsen became eligible for and appeared before the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. It was another moment of fragile hope for Richard and Tamara Davis. They attended the hearing, not to argue for his continued punishment, but to once again plead for the one piece of information he possessed. They offered forgiveness, they offered peace, if he would just tell them where he hid the daughter. Olsen, however, remained uncooperative. He offered no new information, no help, and no genuine remorse. He held fast to the secret he has kept for decades. The parole board's decision was swift and firm. Parole was denied. Their reasoning was a direct echo of the family's pain. The board stated explicitly that his refusal to help authorities find Kiplyn's body was a major factor in the decision. They made it clear that his continued silence was an act of cruelty that prevented any sense of closure. In essence, the system acknowledged that his debt to society was not just about the manslaughter. It was about the ongoing, daily torment his silence inflicts on the Davis family. Timmy Brent Olsen is now scheduled to serve his full sentence, with a release date years in the future. The case of Kiplyn Davis stands as one of the most stark examples of an unsettled verdict. The scales of justice delivered a conviction, but they failed to deliver peace. The legal system, through the shrewd perjury trap and the pressure of a murder charge, successfully broke a decade-long wall of silence and put a guilty man behind bars. But it could not force him to reveal the final, most important secret. To this day, Kiplyn's parents wait. The case is closed, but it is not over. It will never be over until Kiplyn is found. The final word in this story belongs not to the courts, but to Timmy Brent Olsen. And he, stubbornly and cruelly, refuses to speak. This is the final part of the story, a concluding chapter that details the aftermath and the agonizing present. The lingering echo. The story of Kiplyn Davis did not end with Timmy Brent Olsen's prison sentence. For the justice system, the case was closed. But for the Davis family and the other men caught in the perjury trap, the consequences continue to echo, even today. The perjury trap strategy ultimately ensnared a total of 5 former classmates. David Rucker Leifson, the man many, including Kiplyn's father, believe was the unnamed accomplice in Olsen's confession, was convicted of perjury. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison for lying to the grand jury about a confrontation he had with Olsen regarding the case. He has since served his time and been released. Christopher Neil Jepson, who was also charged with Kiplyn's murder alongside Olsen, took a different path. In 2009, he pleaded no contest to a lesser charge of obstruction of justice. As part of his plea, he signed a sworn affidavit, a legal document, stating he had no involvement in Kiplyn's disappearance and had no knowledge of what happened to her. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, which he has served. Gary Blackmore and Scott Brunson also pleaded guilty to perjury for lying to the grand jury. They, too, have served their time. Of the group, only Timmy Brent Olsen was ever convicted for the killing itself. And he remains the only person who holds the key. His 2021 parole hearing was a moment of profound, painful drama. Richard and Tamara Davis attended, not to fight for his continued imprisonment, but to plead with him, once again. They offered him their forgiveness if he would simply grant them the one mercy they have prayed for decades, the location of the daughter's body. Olsen refused. He told the parole board he had already given authorities all the information he had. The board, in turn, flatly denied his parole. They cited a new Utah law, one inspired directly by Kiplyn's case, that allows the board to deny parole to a convicted homicide offender who refuses to cooperate in good faith to locate a victim's remains. The case is now a stark, cold equation. Timmy Brent Olsen is scheduled to serve his full sentence. His release date is set for February 2026. At that point, the state of Utah will have no more legal hold over him. He will be a free man, and he will be free to take his secret with him to his grave. 30 years after she vanished, the porch light at the Davis home remains on, a symbol of hope that Kiplyn will one day come home. Her father, Richard, has written a book about the family's agonizing journey. Her sister runs a Facebook page dedicated to her memory, a digital gathering place for a community that has never stopped looking. The Spanish Fork Police Department still classifies Kiplyn's case as active. They, like her family, are waiting. They are waiting for the day that someone's conscience finally outweighs their fear, or for a hiker in a lonely canyon to stumble upon the one thing that will finally, truly, end this story. Until that day, Kiplyn Davis remains missing, and the verdict remains, for all time, unsettled.